Chapter 8. Puritanical Diet and Medicine. In saying what I shall have to say under the above heading, it is far from my intention to cast any reflections upon the character or the religion of our Puritan ancestors. It is only in reference to some salient peculiarities that a parallel can be drawn which justifies the title to this chapter. It was these peculiarities, growing insensibly out of an ascetic religion, that drew from Lord Macaulay the remark that the Puritans of the epoch of which he was writing hated bear baiting, not because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the spectators. That this was literally true, Macaulay then proceeds to demonstrate by documentary evidence. Of course, this trait of character constituted no part of the religion of Puritanism, per se, but it is undeniable that the characteristic has been inherited by later generations to such an extent that in this country, at least, Puritanism at one time came to be popularly regarded as a religion the fundamental tenet of which was that whatever is pleasurable is necessarily sinful. Whether this was literally true it is aside from our purpose to inquire. But that the acts of our Puritan ancestors often justified the conclusion is a matter of history. It is sufficient for our present purpose to know that the rank and file so believed, and that their belief was justified by the pulpit utterances of such leaders as the Mathers, the Baxters, and their more feeble imitators. Judging from Baxter's utterances, for instance, it would seem that the only pleasurable emotion which he considered at all legitimate was the holy joy naturally arising from the assurance that all other sects were destined to suffer eternal torment in the next world. This pleasure could not reasonably be denied the saints, for, as Baxter informs us, God himself will take infinite pleasure in the eternal torments of the damned. But all other pleasures were inhibited as being sinful. Music, dancing, laughter, feasting, public amusements, and all kinds of games came under the ban, and they even sought to place limitations upon the enjoyment of parental love, as being displeasing in the sight of a jealous God, who was apt to kill the child whose mother's affection for her offspring was just a little too pronounced. In short, any pleasurable indulgence that would afford a momentary relief from the contemplation of the certainty and imminence of death, and the gloom and dampness of the grave, was held to be essentially wicked and deserving of punishment by means of eternal fire. Now, it is a singular psychological fact that when a popular idea takes possession of a community in relation to one subject, it is sure to be carried over to other subjects where an analogy is supposed to exist. The human mind at a certain stage of evolutionary development is prone to seek for analogies, and on the slightest provocation the most momentous scientific conclusions will be drawn from supposed analogies, when in point of fact the two subjects have absolutely nothing in common. Thus, the metamorphosis of the caterpillar into the butterfly has, time out of mind, been supposed to afford a valid scientific argument in proof of the immortality of the human soul, and learned logicians have solemnly set it forth as such in textbooks for the use of schools and colleges. The butterfly as a symbol of immortality is beautiful and poetical, but considered as inductive proof of the survival of the human soul after death, it is grossly illogical and unscientific. The reason is obvious. The laws governing the physical structure and metamorphosis of the butterfly are laws of the organic world, whereas the laws of the human soul are spiritual laws. And it is axiomatic that no legitimate scientific analogy exists between subjects governed by different laws. As well might one hope to solve a mathematical problem by the rules of grammar. On the other hand, the old pagan argument against immortality is invalid for the same reason. I allude to Averroism, or the doctrine of emanation and absorption, which at one time threatened to convert all Europe to paganism. It was an analogical argument of the same specious character as the one alluded to in favor of immortality, for that it sought to justify conclusions relating to a purely spiritual question by reference alone to phenomena of the material universe. In view of this tendency of primitive minds to find analogies where none exist, it is not at all strange that in a community holding fast to the idea that in the moral and social realms whatever is pleasurable is sinful, they should also believe that in the gastronomic world whatever tastes particularly good is necessarily unwholesome, and that the efficacy of medicines is proportioned to their nastiness and the consequent amount of discomfort that can be inflicted on the patient by their administration. I do not undertake to say that this doctrine has been authoritatively formulated, but it was well stated, according to a newspaper anecdote, by a little girl whose Puritan mother had refused her a second piece of pie on the ground that it would make her sick. "Oh, Mama," exclaimed the afflicted little maiden. "It seems as though everything in this world that is real nice is either wicked or indigestible." This expresses the true situation in a nutshell. It is probable that no one has ever formulated the idea that food is unwholesome in proportion to its palatability, but certain it is that an incalculable number of people habitually act upon that principle. It is equally certain that it is the outgrowth, unconscious, perhaps, of the popular puritanical idea, as before stated. Be that as it may, the fact remains, and it must be dealt with in this connection, for it is one of the most prolific sources of suggestions adverse to health that the American people have to encounter. It is obvious that if such a rule of diet is adhered to, there must be a vast number of perfectly wholesome articles of food brought under the ban at every table where the rule prevails. Children especially are made to suffer by being deprived, wholly or in part, of those things which every healthy normal stomach craves. Besides, the constant suggestions imparted to children in regard to the indigestibility of everything that they are fond of inevitably weakens their digestive powers, and many are thus converted into chronic dyspeptics before their milk teeth are shed. Now, there are certain things that may be more effectively used as illustrations of what is meant, because of a radical change in popular opinion in relation to them within a few years. For instance, half a century ago watermelons were under the ban, and were consequently partaken of with great caution and many misgivings as to their digestibility. Nobody could offer a plausible explanation why a watermelon contained the seeds of disease, and yet the fact remained that numerous cases of cholera morbus were traced to indulgence in that luxury. Children were especially cautioned against eating all they wanted of it, and solemn warnings of the wrath to come accompanied every little piece that was doled out. Of course, vigorous introspection followed every indulgence, and everybody who ate watermelon in the evening went to bed with his mind prepared for a wrestle with cholera morbus before morning. That the legitimate result of the suggestion frequently followed goes without saying. A notable exception must be made in favor of the nocturnal small boy who gorged himself to repletion upon stolen watermelons. He was immune, for nobody was present to suggest the deadly character of the fruit, and he had something to think about besides watching for symptoms of approaching dissolution. He only knew that watermelon tasted good, and he was not up in the then current dietetic science which proscribed watermelon for that very reason. Fortunately for the watermelon trade, as well as for the health of the community, it was discovered some years ago that there is absolutely nothing in the constituent elements of watermelon to justify its bad reputation. The celebrated Dr. Tanner was the first to call public attention to the fact. He had analyzed it and found nothing in it more deadly than a little sugar mixed with a large proportion of water. He experimented with it and found that it was more easily digested than any other no product of the soil, and hence he chose it as the very best and safest means of breaking his celebrated 40 days fast. On that occasion, he simply gorged himself with watermelon, pure and simple, to the consternation of the attending physicians and the horror of the general public. But as the result justified the doctor's prognosis, the watermelon scored a signal triumph, and in due course of time it ceased its diabolical work, and now everybody eats it with impunity. The suggestion has been removed. Hard-boiled eggs is another very popular article of diet that was for many years under the ban, evidently for no other reason than because every child likes hard-boiled eggs better than he does the half-cooked, mussy, soft-boiled egg. That being the case, of course he must be deprived of it on the usual ground, or if one is reluctantly given to him, he is duly and solemnly informed that it will make him sick. This state of affairs continued for centuries, and it is even now in evidence among the more ignorant families. But the prejudice has been gradually dying out since doctors began to prescribe hard-boiled eggs as a highly nutritious and easily digested article of diet for dyspeptics. They argue that cooking food until it is palatable does not render it indigestible. On the contrary, the palatability of food is one of the first essentials to its digestibility, for the reason that it increases the secretion of saliva and the gastric juices. In fact, it may be set down as a general rule that, other things being equal, and the element of suggestion eliminated, the more palatable a food is, the easier it is digested and assimilated. Hence it is that what is one man's meat is another man's poison, which is but another way of saying that not all digestive organs are alike. That which is easy for one person to digest is difficult for another, but as a rule the one who likes a particular article is the one who can digest it, and vice versa. In fact, it may be set down as a dietetic axiom that the unperverted stomach craves it can digest. By unperverted stomach, I mean one whose powers have not been destroyed by suggestion or other abuses. Of course, this is the exact opposite to the puritanical rule of which we have been speaking. But physicians are rapidly coming to the conclusion that the human stomach craves most that which it most needs, and that one's appetite is a pretty safe guide to a healthful diet. That is to say, the subjective mind instinctively knows the needs of the physical organism, and it makes its wants known to the objective consciousness by appropriate stimuli. Thus, in the presence of the needed food, and often by thinking of it, the salivary glands are stimulated to action, and thus the first prerequisite to good digestion is provided in an increased flow of saliva. The stomach itself is stimulated to action by the same means, and a consequent secretion of the gastric juices is induced, thus rendering the process of digestion easy and pleasurable. It follows that the opposite course will produce opposite results, and digestion of food that the stomach rejects, or does not crave, is correspondingly slow and difficult. Hence it is that the intelligent physician of the present time is seemingly careless of his patient's diet, and generally tells him to eat what he likes. If he restricts the diet at all, it is generally because the patient seems to expect it, and perhaps would be unfavorably impressed if the doctor failed to make a showing of wisdom in that way. In such cases, the average doctor will inhibit something that he does not happen to like himself, and each one seems to have his pet aversion. I knew a doctor in Washington whose bête noire was boiled cabbage, and he invariably told his patients that they could eat anything they liked except boiled cabbage. Boiled cabbage, he would oracularly set forth, is absolutely indigestible, even by a well man. To say nothing of one whose stomach is weakened by disease. Of course, the majority of his patients knew by experience that for anyone who likes it, boiled cabbage is perfectly easy to digest, and that it is a staple article of diet for thousands whose stomachs have never revealed their existence by any sensation except that of hunger. But they soon learned that the doctor would wax hysterical if they ventured to defend boiled cabbage against his indictment. Other doctors have their pet aversions which they exploit in a similar way, but there are few left who venture to adhere to the old rule that whatever a patient likes must, for that reason alone, be inhibited. Half a century ago, the latter rule prevailed largely among the medical profession in this country. Of those who can remember so far back, few can forget the affectionate, insinuating solicitude with which the average doctor and the nurse would urge a convalescing patient to try to think of something that he would like to eat. And no one will forget the fact that when some article was named, the doctor would invariably shake his head, look preternaturally wise, and totally and inexorably inhibit that particular article as being hurtful, indigestible, and otherwise altogether unsuited to the patient's condition at that particular stage of his disease or of his convalescence. After securing a full list of articles that the patient thought he could relish, he would be informed that disease had so vitiated his appetite that he necessarily craved only those articles of diet that were injurious to him in his then condition, and the homily would end by the prescription of some sick dish that the patient had already been fed on ad nauseam, and it was generally some tasteless, innutritious mess that would turn the stomach of a hungry dog. Many cases of chronic dyspepsia were traceable to this practice, and the worst of it was that the results often seemed to justify the practice. Thus, a physician would strenuously inhibit a favorite dish merely because the patient liked it and wanted it. The inhibition would be accompanied by the usual homily on the indigestibility of that particular article, and the patient would often be warned to be very careful about indulging too freely in it even after his health was restored. The suggestion would naturally take effect, and it frequently happened that the patient could never afterward indulge with impunity in his favorite dish. Nor did it matter how harmless the article might be. I knew a boy once who during convalescence was urged to tell what he would relish most in the way of food, and in reply named a certain variety of apples of which he was particularly fond. Of course, he could not have that particular variety, and he was asked to name another. But he would have his favorite or none, whereupon he was told that he could have any other variety in the orchard, but that particular apple was extremely hard to digest, and that indulgence in it would most likely cause a relapse. He was, of course, forced to forego his desires, and was in the end fed on that which he most abominated. He managed to survive and fully regained his health, but when he came to indulge in his favorite variety of apples, he found that they invariably gave him a fit of indigestion. The suggestion had taken effect. That it was suggestion, pure and simple, and that it was the one enforced upon him on the occasion referred to, is evidenced by the fact that no other variety of apples had that effect upon his digestive apparatus. That the suggestions made at the same time in regard to other foods did not have the same effect upon him was doubtless due to the fact that he had not especially craved anything but the apples, and hence the inhibition of other things had not so surprised and annoyed him. But when he was told that his favorite variety of apples was, alone of all others, indigestible, his surprise and annoyance were complete, and the impression was lasting. Be that as it may, certain it is that no other article of diet troubled him, and many years afterward, when he came to a knowledge of the law of suggestion, he was enabled to throw off the spell by a vigorous course of autosuggestion, and he thus restored the Rambo to the list of digestible fruits. But many victims of dietetic suggestions made on that principle during convalescence were not so fortunate, for thousands have suffered all their subsequent lives from having such suggestions enforced upon them in regard to the most simple and wholesome articles of diet. Most of them believe that their sickness was responsible for their subsequent stomach troubles, and they wonder why it is that their former favorite foods have ceased to be digestible, little realizing that it was because it was their favorite food that the doctor inhibited it during convalescence. Happily, as before intimated, there are but few dietetic cranks of the kind left among the doctors, and the patient is now generally left to choose his own diet, except in certain cases where solid foods are dangerous, as in typhoid fever. But many victims of the old practice still survive to make themselves and their families miserable by nursing the delusion that whatever is real nice is either wicked or indigestible. It was not, however, alone in regard to diet that the doctors of the early part of the last century practiced upon the principle that whatever was gratifying to the patient must, for that reason, be inhibited. Thus, it was long held as a cardinal principle of practice in cases of fever that the patient must be kept in a close, warm room, and on no account be allowed to drink cold water or even to indulge in thoughts of snow or ice. Why? No one was ever able to give any better reason than that fresh air, cold water, or ice would have given comfort and pleasure to the patient. If forced to attempt a philosophical explanation of the system, it would be said that, being sick, the patient's tastes are vitiated, the whole order of nature is reversed, and he necessarily craves only that which is hurtful. Of course, the explanation was as idiotic as the practice was abominable, but it revealed its origin in the then prevalent puritanical idea that in the moral realm whatever is pleasurable is necessarily sinful. Other illustrations might be given of the practice, for they were numerous, but these must suffice. I have mentioned this one because it was typical, and no one who suffered from a fever in the olden time and survived the treatment will fail to verify what I have said. Happily, most of the old doctors who practiced under the system are dead, and physicians of the present day have reversed the practice. A fever patient is now given the benefit of all the fresh air available. He is allowed to drink all the cold water he wants. Chopped ice is placed within his reach, and he is treated to cold ablutions at stated intervals. The result is that fever is no longer an unmitigated torture, and even typhoid fever is largely shorn of its ancient horrors. Good nursing is now the salient feature of treatment of that disease, and good nursing consists in doing everything to give the patient comfort by mitigating the severity of the fever. Under the old regime, a good typhoid fever nurse was one who would, with grim determination, refuse the appeals of the patient for some mitigation of the torture and cram a hideous mixture down her throat at frequent intervals. Again, the popular idea of medicine was derived from the same puritanical source. Hence it was that the efficiency of medicine was measured by its nastiness. No medicine that was pleasant to the taste was considered of any therapeutic value whatever. The old Thomsonian, or botanical, system of medicine was apparently devised with special reference to that principle. At any rate, it fell on fruitful soil. For it made its appearance at the supreme psychological moment when the value of all things was measured by the one standard. If there was any other standard of therapeutic value than that of nastiness in the Thomsonian materia medica, it certainly was not manifest to the taste. In that system, the relative therapeutic values of its different medicines were indicated by numerals. And no, I stood for that supreme herbal abomination known to botanists as Lobelia inhalata. If that herb had been selected to stand at the head of the list solely because of its nasty taste, no better selection could have been made. But it was selected because no human stomach could endure its presence for 5 minutes if the victim had sufficient vitality left to throw it off. In other words, it was used solely as an emetic, and an emetic was always indicated under the Thomsonian system, no matter what the disease might be. That the patient, if he survived, invariably felt better after recovering from the effects of a lobelia emetic goes without saying, for it would be impossible for him to feel worse than when that particular variety of emetic was performing its mission. There are, in fact, more reasons than one why he should feel better after such an ordeal. In the first place, he feels both glad and surprised to find himself alive, and as the discomforts of illness are comparative, a lobelia emetic causes all other human miseries to seem pleasurable. Moreover, if he survives, he is encouraged, for his doctor is then enabled to pronounce a favorable prognosis. Such an abounding vitality was equal to any emergency. This, in point of fact, was the secret of the undeniable success which attended the Thomsonian system of practice in its early days. In addition to the universal nastiness of its decoctions, it required each patient to go through a certain definite course of medicine, in which the lobelia emetic, followed by steaming and sweating, was the never-failing initiatory torture. If his vitality was equal to the strain, well and good. If not, his death was charged up to divine providence, or to the doctor having been called too late, or to the apothecary doctors previously in charge of the case. This, however, is a slight digression. My principal object in writing this chapter and the one preceding it is to show what an infinite variety of suggestions adverse to health are current in every civilized community. My ultimate object being to impress upon the mind of the reader the importance of studying the law of suggestion and its relations to that most important of the affairs of everyday life, the diet upon which he feeds himself and those dependent upon him. No one needs to be told of the prepotent influence upon his health of the food he eats, nor does anyone need to be informed that the benefit which one derives from food depends upon his powers of digestion and assimilation. But the majority of people do need to be informed that their powers of digestion and assimilation are absolutely within their own control. This is, indeed, the most important fact connected with the science of mental medicine, and when it is once generally understood, appreciated, and intelligently acted upon, the science of healing disease by any process, mental or material, will be found to be of comparatively little importance.